Hello and welcome to The Current Thing with me, Nick Dixon, where we talk about the culture war, politics and anything else that comes up. I think it's going to be quite political today because we have someone from Reform UK, the up-and-coming party in Britain, and I'm talking about the wonderful Belinda DeLucy. Thanks for doing the show, Belinda.
Thank you so much for having me on, Nick. It's been lovely to meet you briefly in the green room on occasion, so it's a real pleasure and honour to be with you on this platform.
Oh yeah, the green room at GB News.
Yes.
Well, maybe we'll talk about GB later because you're on there quite a lot,
Yes.
like me.
Yes.
But first I was going to ask a very softball question. How did you get into all this mad political scene?
Totally by chance. I have never wanted to get into. I've never wanted to be in politics or be a politician at all. It wasn't where I thought my life was going. But 2016 was a massive crunch time for me when the Parliament and our five major parties went into total spasm about delivering on a vote. And I was sitting at home thinking, gosh, I had been naive to think that, you know, all my trust should be in these people in the seat of power, and it had been completely and utterly crushed. And I found it quite scary. So I started to protest outside Parliament and on my own, just as you do.
Wow.
When I dropped the kids off at school, just about delivering the Brexit vote. And I was studying a master's in EU law at the time. So I kind of felt like I had a good sort of authority, at least, to speak on the issue. And I was picked up by Richard Tice and Nigel Farage on the March to Leave, which was, I don't know if any of your listeners remember, the big 2-week walk from Sunderland to London in 2019, sort of March time, where we went into all the northern towns, gathering up people to take to Westminster to show our displeasure at the knavery and treachery on a Shakespearean level that was going on in our beloved Parliament. And that was enough to push me into politics and to be an example, at least to my children, of what you have to do when there is an injustice. You just have to stand up and put your neck on the line and fight for what you believe in.
Yeah, so you were radicalised by Brexit and the betrayal of the country, really, by the elite, or whatever you want to call it. I remember that walk being pretty bad weather. Is that the one that was like really awful weather?
Yes, it was the walk that was pouring with rain. We were smoke bombed at the beginning by protesters. We were followed by arch Romaniacs in hooded jackets spying on us, and led by donkeys, I think, also followed us with a van depicting us as, you know, the usual sort of racists and that sort of thing. It was quite harrowing, but I did feel like actually the country was more with us and against us, and it was more, you know, I trust the British people far more than I do our politicians once they've entered Westminster. And throughout history, whenever the people have pushed for more power and more of a say in the laws we live under, those in power have always pushed back, and it was taking the fight to Westminster. And yes, I suppose I was slightly radicalised by that.
Whenever you're on the other side to led by donkeys, you're on the correct side. Because if anyone doesn't know, they're like a cringe kind of middle class, like you just picture them drinking like craft ales and coming up with their brilliant take on why the EU is amazing. They're the most cringe centrist dad satire group imaginable. Is that fair?
Yes, I would say they were very sort of the people's vote lot. They probably had a lovely champers picnic on their way, following us dirty, messy plebs, the masses that they loathe so much, but very much, I would say, yes, middle class privilege, the same sort of stop oil activists that throw soups at paintings, you know, because they have nothing better to do.
They're kind of like if James O'Brien was cloned, lost his radio job and thought, I'll do an internet satire thing. Yeah, all right. Well, why should people vote Reform? Because I guess I'm a potential voter, although in my area, Labour are going to crush it, and we can talk later about the flaws of our political system. But why should I vote Reform, and what is Reform? Because it came obviously from the Brexit Party.
Yes.
And then how would you sort of summarise it and why we should vote for them?
Well, Reform isn't like any other party. It's not right, it's not left, it doesn't want to mimic the Conservative Party or the Labour Party. It's just offering a different choice at the ballot box, because at the moment we're really just faced with two parties. One is bad, the other is worse, and that's all that's on offer. And to be honest, if you have socially conservative views, if you want to decrease the levels of immigration, if you want to be much tougher on illegal immigration, if you want to be tougher on depoliticizing our public sector, then Reform really is the only space, the only political party that offers that. The Conservatives talk a good talk, of course. They talk tough on the boats, but very little action is done. We're the action party. And what I love about Reform UK is it's very much the same sort of principles as the Brexit Party. It's always country before party. And what we've seen, certainly in the last 12 years with the Conservative Party, is they've put the party first and foremost as their priority, above the interests of the country. It's why many of them voted for May's terrible deal that no one in their right mind could sign. It's like a surrender treaty in wartime. And yet the likes of Boris signed up to it in the end because the Conservative Party was far more important than, the unity and being able to win an election was far more important than the best interests of the country. So Reform is for the people, it's for the country. It's why we stood down the 300 candidates in the 2019 election when we were the Brexit Party, because it wasn't about us. So Reform UK is not about being in love with a political party. It's about being in love with your country and matching words with action and having the courage to be disliked by the metropolitan chattering classes who seem to have complete control over everything we do, whether it's in the civil service or our schools or any other area of our public sector. So it's very raw, it's very real. We'll rock the boats, I'm sure, with what we say, but I think we reflect a voice that is often squashed by the political and media classes. And we're not scared of doing so. And I'm very excited about it.
So, yeah, and just for the listener, you were talking about Theresa May's kind of soft Brexit deal that was thought to be kind of selling out Brexit,
Yes.
basically. And the other thing, you talked about standing down the candidates, which was something Farage was sort of got in trouble for. People said, oh, that was a sort of sellout in some way. But that was, like you say, it was a pragmatic move. And you talk about being the action party. My question is Reform focused very much on competence rather than culture? Because Richard Taisha, current leader, talks about high growth, low taxes, small state, which is a kind of Thatcherite vision. And some of the policies I've seen almost sound like Lib Dem policies from the 90s. They're kind of like, let's increase the threshold of income tax and things like that. Totally reasonable, but not necessarily that radical. And there was something that Steve Edgerton posted, and I should have checked it. I can't remember the exact thing, but he said that immigration was mentioned on something like bullet point 18 on the 32nd page or vice versa, something like that. And my concern was the Reformers sort of selling themselves like, we're not right-wing guys, don't worry, we're just competent. And because you can hit the Tories on competence where they fail, but you can also hit them on not being conservative at all. But are you addressing both of those, or is it more the focus on these sort of Thatcherite high growth thing?
Well, I don't even know what right-wing means anymore. The term right-wing or far-right, these terms have been so abused by the left, fascist, Nazi. I mean, I've been called a Nazi since I entered politics just for wanting the UK to make its own laws. So that's why I'm rather reluctant to call it, a right wing or a party that is conservative in nature. That's why I say socially conservative party. It is, I would say, in essence, very right of centre in terms of protecting our history, our culture, safeguarding childhood, safeguarding our borders, and making sure we have sustainable levels of immigration. And although you say it was far down on the list, you must remember we are a relatively new party, and people associate Reform UK with the Brexit Party. They know where we stand essentially on topics like this, and we wanted to show other areas and new areas that we form policy on that we hadn't talked about yet. I know that Nigel has spent a long time covering the boat crisis. In fact, if it hadn't been for Nigel Farage with his videos down in Dover, I'm not sure it would be so much in the news. So I think we have made that clear, but now is the time to increase attention on our other policies. I would never, Reform UK will always be focused on sustainable immigration with the consent of the people. Immigration's been democratized. No matter how you vote now, it seems like immigration's constantly on the increase. Conservatives promise again and again and again to reduce it to sustainable levels, and they fail and they do the opposite. So it's almost like we no longer have a say about the changing demographics of our country, about how many people in towns and cities use the infrastructure. That's what we want to bring back to Reform UK. People need to have a firm say in how our country is going to be in the future, and how many people, who we let in and out of our country, and how our infrastructure can cope.
And interesting. I mean, everyone's going to be called a Nazi on our side, so that's which I call the normal people side. I mean, like you say, right wing. What does it mean anymore? It just means normal. I've started thinking of it as just normal people and mental weirdos. So, I mean, and you've got blonde hair and blue eyes, so it's not helping you, Belinda. This whole Nazi thing.
I know, it really isn't. I get called far worse. That's probably one of the more honestly the attacks you get, especially. Weirdly, as a woman, it's almost like, because I'm female, I'm supposed to be nice and kind and compromising and sweet, and I don't think I could be more fierce and, you know, determined to do what's right by this country. So a lot of women dislike me because they feel like I've betrayed the sort of soft, gentle, appeasing, compromising sex, which I think's incredibly sexist anyway. But most of the criticisms and abuse I got during my political year was from women, not men. It's interesting.
That's interesting. As if you shouldn't be doing this. That's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. I think of you as one of the nicer people on our side, because the sort of, when I say our side, the normal people side, has some people who are, you go, I agree with that person, but they're a bit of a dick. But I never think that about you. So I think we have to sort of be charming when we're selling these things. But I mean, yeah, obviously you're tough, but I don't think of you as like not nice or something. But that's, it's interesting that women have criticized you. But when you talk about immigration, but you also talk about growth, some people would argue, well, we can't have growth without immigration because our birth rates are too low. Where's this growth going to come from? Have you ever had that question?
Yeah, I have. You know, it's interesting. When Germany opened the floodgates during the sort of 2015-16 migrant crisis, of course, they look compassionate doing it, but one of the reasons is because they have one of the lowest birth rates in the world, only second to Japan. And I think behind the scenes, they were thinking, well, this is how we fix it. Instead of addressing the population in the country on how they can encourage families to have more children. It's difficult. We have 5 million people of workforce age that are eligible to work on the dole at the moment. I think it's far more important we invest in them, we believe in them, we don't throw them to the scrap heap like you hear so many on the lib left say, oh, you know, Brits won't do the work, they're lazy, so we need to open the doors to another workforce abroad. I think that's deeply insulting and wrong and creating an underclass. I think we should encourage and motivate and inspire the 5 million Brits back into work, help them apprenticeships, you know, give them reasons to have the dignity of work again, because we're having generation after generation out of work, almost becoming a culture like thing. And I don't understand why parties aren't focusing on the people already here and training them and investing in them, because every human has something to give and offer. But we sort of assigned them to the scrap heap and said, oh, well, let's just forget about them, pay them not to work and open the doors to other people. No, let's train our British domestic workforce up and back them first.
Yeah, we have that disastrous situation where more than half the country are taking more from the system than they're putting in financially, which is just shocking. And like you say, people get forgotten. I mean, I've been on benefits in my troubled youth, and it's very hard to get out of. There's no incentive to get out of it. I mean, I think a party should just incentivize work in a radical way, where they just make it easy to get back to work, and not this thing of like, you'll be punished and lose your benefits. Because no human, it's very hard anyway. You can do it, but it takes a lot of character to say, I'm going to lose money and go back to work. So they're not incentivized to work.
It's crazy that we're even having this conversation. That there's so much ridiculousness and almost insane policies that have been allowed to go on behind the back door. And one of them is paying people more not to work than to work. This is so demoralizing, and also I think it puts us at risk, because if we depend on a foreign workforce all the time, you know, we never know what's going to hit us next in terms of supply chains, and then where are we left? Look at our NHS. We've depended so much on a foreign workforce to supply NHS staff that as soon as the pandemic hit, we lost a huge amount of people. We should be training our own nurses and doctors. That's what I believe anyway.
Yeah, I agree. But do you think, so this is a silly question in a way for you, because you obviously don't think the country is finished or you wouldn't be doing this, but one thing I ask a lot of people is the country finished? Because I've noticed this widespread despair about the country amongst ordinary people as well, not necessarily even political people, not necessarily conservative people, and loads of people think it. And I asked people on this podcast, and Francis Foster felt it was, and I confess I've written an article on my Substack called England is Lost Forever, so I can be a bit pessimistic. Jeff Norcott felt it wasn't, and I realised that might just be because he owns a house, because then we had Callum on last week from the Lotus Eaters podcast, and he talks about housing being a massive problem. Young people can't get a house, so he's looking at it going, this country is finished. He's looking at, and he's even been to Russia, and he's been to Afghanistan, he's been to all these countries, and he was going, in some ways these countries are better than Britain, because he's going, I'm never going to get a house. And even me, I took on a second whole job. I mean, maybe I need to speak to GB about paying me more, but I mean, got the second highest views when I hosted Headliners the other night, second highest views on the channel. Just saying, guys. Don't know why I'm telling you, should be telling them. But it's like I had to do a second job as an editor of a website. I was working 7 days a week just trying to get a mortgage, and even I can't do it. I've given up. But what do people do about when things like housing is so bad? And is this country finished? Presumably you think it's not.
Well, I'm an optimist. I was born smiling, apparently. And yes, that may mean I'm naive on occasion. But the thing that's got this country through every turmoil, from famines to civil war to voters' rights, we have won. The people have always progressed and won. And that is why my faith has always been with the people rather than necessarily with our politicians. And there's a lot to be optimistic about. We have changed the direction of this country. I know it wasn't the Brexit deal that we were hoping for, but we are pulling back from globalization just with that very move. And we are making politicians more accountable. In terms of housing, it's impossible to keep up with 500,000 people coming into our country every year, and as forecasted, millions coming in over the next 4 years without the infrastructure, without the housing. It's a terrible, toxic combination. That's why we need to slow everything down a bit and start building more houses for the people living here first. That's who we should be accommodating. No, I'm an optimist because there are times in this country, think of 1973, you had Edward Heath, and he has this famous quote saying that Britain is the Titanic sinking. And he said, the only lifeboat is to join the EEC. So he made up, the fact that Europe was going to save us. It didn't. But the fact is, in the 70s, the morale was far lower than it is now. It all changed around with the Thatcher years. And I think we are at a cross point now where people need to be very careful who they vote for. If they want more of the same, declinism, defeatism, politicians who want to peacock on the international stage more than listen to the people at home and try and win their applause. We need to get rid of that lot. We need to have politicians in power that look to the British people first and stop worrying about impressing Biden and the EU and selling the country out. But this will happen. We have changed the course of history time and time again. The little people, the men and women on the ground, and we'll do it again, Nick.
Okay, well, I like the optimistic vision. I'm very pessimistic, so it's good to have the balance. And one place that Reform, I just read an article, Reform are doing, well, I skimmed it, Reform are doing well in rural areas, because I'm from the country, I'm from the lakes in Cumbria, so, the lakes tend to, and Cumbria and these rural areas tend to be quite like NIMBY, they don't want planning, to build anything around there. So how come Reform are doing well in rural areas? Why is that? What's that about?
That's interesting. My mum's from Carlisle, actually. Yeah, she's
cool.
a northern lass. I think people are not switching from Conservative to Labour. I think people are switching off politics altogether. And the people that the Tories are going to lose at the next election have nowhere to go. And we as Reform UK, we are offering so many old conservative kind of ideas married with great sort of liberal left-leaning, sometimes, in terms of, as you said, raising the threshold of income tax. We're like we're old school, and people don't want constant change and constant progression. And I feel that in rural communities, they enjoy the countryside as it is. They don't want a super high population in this country, where we have to build millions of homes every year across beautiful land. And we're the only party that's very, very tough on immigration levels coming down. And that appeals. And also, I feel like with the Conservative Party, I don't feel like our country, our heritage, our culture is safe. In our schools, there are all sorts of things being taught to our children. The decolonisation of our history, critical race theory being taught, gender ideology being taught. There are a lot of people, certainly like me, who feel socially conservative, that hate the idea of our children being exposed to this in schools, but the Tories have allowed it to happen. Labour champions it to happen, and people are cottoning on to the idea that actually this isn't inevitable. There is another choice. Let's put our cross on the ballot box for the party we believe will protect childhood, protect our culture, our history, our language, our traditions, in a way that the other parties don't. I can see that appealing to the rural community.
Sorry to interrupt this frankly excellent episode, but we have a special offer. If you're trying to lose weight because, I don't know, you're 40 and your only joy is eating chocolate mousses at night, then you need Harry Willis. Harry is guaranteeing that if you work with him, you'll lose 5 kilograms in your first 5 weeks, or he'll coach you for free until you do. Harry is a fitness, transformation and health coach. He's a writer for the international fitness brand Techno Gym, and Harry will design a bespoke plan for your workouts and diet and will work with you one-on-one the whole way until you lose that weight. And he's offering a free 45-minute consultation for listeners of this podcast. Just get in touch and quote the current thing. And you can find Harry at Instagram at Harry_Willis or www.willis-coaching.com. Willis is WILLIS-coaching.com. And I've seen the results he gets with people, and they are very impressive. So go to at Harry_Willis on Instagram or www.williscoaching.com, and I'm sure he's going to get great results for you. Now back to the show. And what about the criticism that Dan Wootton issued to Richard Tice on GB News, where he kept saying this is a vote for Labour by the back door? You're going to take away Tory votes and get Labour.
Yeah, I totally disagree with that. We, the Conservative Party, have been using that as a threat now for years. Vote for us out of fear. Vote for us not because you believe in us, but because you just don't want what's worse. And back in 2009, they had the sort of scary Corbyn face to really frighten people into voting Conservative. They don't have that with Keir Starmer. And in fact, the Conservative Party mirrors the Labour Party so much. It's like having a pink and red party choice, that Reform won't be stealing votes off anyone. If the Conservatives want to give away votes, if they want to turn their backs on voters so that they've left the voters haven't left the Tory party, then we're offering them another home. If the Conservatives want to win the next election, Nick, they can. It's been up to them. They choose to choose policy after policy that's weak and unpopular, and their rhetoric may be good, but they're disappointing. So we're just offering another home. So I do think Dan's wrong on that.
Yeah, I mean, the Tories completely imploded. When they got rid of Boris, who was obviously very popular with the people, and they got rid of him in this weird coup. Then they brought in Liz Truss, who was the members' choice. Then they got rid of her in another weird coup, and they brought in the person they obviously wanted, which was Rishi. And at that point, I just thought, the Tories are absolutely finished, and anyone could sort of beat them at that point. Not that you're anyone, but Reform was polling very well. And they were polling very well without people necessarily knowing that much about them, and without Farage as leader. And it was extraordinary. And it had something like 10% in a poll and things like this. And I thought, this is an open goal. Yeah. But now, maybe it's changed slightly in that, let's not give him too much credit, but Rishi Sunak, because he's probably desperate because they're up against it and they're going to lose the next election, he's actually been doing some okay things. He's got this Windsor framework, not probably what you would want with Brexit, but it's sort of okay-ish, lots of people think. And then he's doing things on small boats, at least trying to tackle it. He's trying to tackle the schools sex education problem, which we might talk about in a bit. He's trying to tackle various things that he said he would. He's talked about that he knows what a woman is. He's the only leading politician that knows what a woman is. Starmer doesn't. The leader of New Zealand has no idea. So, is that going to slightly harm Reform, the fact that Sunak seems like he might be vaguely competent and vaguely conservative?
Well, I think you're right in as much as the infighting in the Conservative Party, will bring about their demise far more than a party like Reform. The thing we have to take into consideration is, yes, Rishi is scared about the next election. I'm not surprised. I think they're going to get a hammering in the May local elections. So the Conservative rhetoric is really pumping up at the moment. And the talk about grooming gangs, the talk about what children are being taught in schools, completely inappropriate, ideologies being taught to young children that are damaging them and indoctrinating them. Yes, he started to talk about these things. I would just take issue. I don't think he's come out and said women are adult human females. I think the most that Rishi said when asked what a woman is, oh, whatever Boris said. And he said that 3 times. So I wouldn't say he is a mad, passionate man on speaking biological truths. He does still come across to me as a little bit of a wimp. But again, it's all talk, Nick. What we want to see is policy and action. Do the Tories have time to put their tough talk into action before the next election? I'm not sure. I think the mere reason why he hasn't diverted from EU law yet, there's a bill to get rid of cumbersome EU law that costs $1 billion to small businesses, but it hasn't got through Parliament. It could have done. Rishi doesn't. He's a slow man on this. So I think it's all talk and no trousers at the moment. But listen, great if he does it. I'll still stick with reform. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I need to double check that because I thought he'd said the other day that he did know what a woman was. I know initially he said whatever the Prime Minister said back when he was Chancellor, and that was pathetic. But I think recently I thought he'd said it, but I need to check that. Maybe I'm giving him too much credit. But because he does change his mind depending on, he goes anti-woke and then he changes his mind. Yeah, and it is weird. I mean, things like the Worker Protection Bill, which is awful, where you'll be able to sue your employer if a customer says something and a member of staff is offended. This is a mad Lib Dem bill that's kind of on the verge of getting through. All kinds of things like this somehow get through with the Tories. And everyone knows they're not conservative at all. So is it a problem for your party Reform, that people don't really know what it is? Like even me, and it's my job to follow this stuff, but even me a few months ago, I knew when it changed from Brexit Party to Reform because that was a big story. I was like, okay, they've gone a different direction. That's quite a big story. But then I kind of forgot. And then Lawrence Fox came out with Reclaim, which is probably a nightmare for you because they get mixed up in people's heads. And people don't really know that much about them. Yeah. And yet, like I said, they were still polling quite well because the Tories are doing so badly. But the people, and my follow-up question on that is, can it work without Farage? And will Farage ever come back to it? Because you're doing okay without Farage, but with Farage, it could go huge.
Completely. And Farage has always been there as a great advisor, and he's always championing the party. But I think, to be fair to Nigel, he has given decades of his life in service to this country, and put up with so much abuse, so many threats against him. I feel like, his slight break, if you like, from the political world is not only well deserved for his peace of mind, but I think, he's really done so much already. It is time to make Reform the faces of everyone in this country, and to make many leaders out of the people who feel the same as us. But I will always happily take advice and counsel from Nigel. He was the best boss I have ever worked for in my life, if you can call him a boss, when we were in the EU Parliament. I know he's the pantomime villain in papers, and they need a sort of, mad, bad Brexit crim. But he is an incredibly well-read, especially on Britain's war history, historian. He is one of the most kindest, compassionate gentlemen I've ever met, and I would love any input he has into the party. But we've got incredible people in Reform. We've got Anne Widdecombe, who was a battle axe in Brussels. You should have seen her walking into the Parliament, Nick. She had all the sort of men like tremor when she walked past and did her speeches. She was absolutely phenomenal. We just need more people in politics with the courage of their conviction and who don't mind being disliked. And I think Nigel's given a great example of how to stand up for your beliefs. And so we'll follow that. But Richard Tice is fantastic as well. And it's because of Richard that Reform UK still exists. He's been keeping it waiting in the wings and worked so hard to keep it alive. I don't blame people who don't know too much about Reform. As I said, we're a small party. We don't have the money, the backing, the networks that Labour and the Conservatives have, but we have passion and conviction, and let's see how far that takes us.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask you what it's like working with Nigel, because I worked with him vaguely in the GB studio, but he was just in there, and he never spoke to me, and then he's moved to the posher Westminster studio. But it's interesting you say he was kind and compassionate. That would be surprising some people. But yeah, because they obviously, like you say, he's the pantomime villain. And obviously Tice is an impressive person, very impressive in business. He seems like he's probably a good leader. So yeah, I'm not dissing Richard Tice by any means. But yeah, it's the question of whether people know who they are. And the other question is, what is the goal? Because, so the problem we have in this country is first past the post. So in my area, Labour are going to win it by an absurd amount of votes no matter what I do. So I tend to vote with my conscience. I voted for an obscure Christian party because they were the only one that was saying the things I care about. They had some good policies. They were like, get Brexit done, be tough on crime, make big tech pay their taxes, and protect the lives of the unborn. Who could disagree with any of that? I threw that last one in at the end, but some people might disagree.
Yeah.
But I thought, well, I have to vote with my conscience, so I voted for them. But because we're not going to win anyway with any of these parties, Reform are doing well. I've spoken to 2 people who work for Tory MPs as their job and are still going to vote Reform. So that tells you where the Tories are. But my question is, what is the goal? Because is it just to hold the Tories to account, much like Farage's parties have done in history, or is it to actually win seats? And can that be done in our current system?
Do you know, I think, it wasn't that long ago, relatively speaking, that there was no such thing as the Labour Party. I believe it's maybe 110 years old or something like that. And they come now, they're, polling the highest out of any party in the UK. It may take time. And it will take time, but we've got people on board that are invested in it and want it to grow. Yes, the goal is to become a completely independent political party. We're not here to be some kind of puppet or controller of any other party. We're fresh, we're independent. We want people to feel like we're a new home. And it is the type of politician that we want to attract and have in our party. The calibre of politicians in Westminster is so low at the moment. And they're so much more worried about their job or position in the party than doing what's right. And that's what we want to change. And I think we will be different. But no, I don't think our job is just to hold the Tories to account or their feet to the fire. This is a serious political party. And yes, it may take time, but you have to start somewhere.
Yeah, and it was 1900 apparently that Labour was formed. I just checked it. So you're right. I mean, we've had lots of changes. We've had the Lib Dems came about, and we've had the SDP, which has changed, and all kinds of things. So yeah, you're right. It's not set in stone. We feel like it's set in stone in this country. That it's Labour and Tory, but it's not. These parties can be destroyed if they're totally awful. Which the Tories, I feel like they were definitely bordering on that recently. I'm not sure it's going to happen now, but it was definitely on the verge. What was your view or Reform's view or on lockdowns? It just came to me. I wanted to know your view on that because I was very against them, obviously.
I was against them from the start. I got COVID right back in 2020, I think in February. As soon as it was starting out in the news, I had it. Before vaccines, my whole family had it. Oh, it was a bit rough. A rough cold is all I can describe it as. I wish we had just protected the elderly and the vulnerable. I really do. I think that was the way forward, to completely crash the economy and to hurt everyday, normal, hard-working people for a disease or an infection that wasn't 99% survival rate was wrong. It was panicky. It's so typical of this sort of fear-controlled politics. And I'm not a fan of it. I don't think you should control people through fear ever. So I've always been against lockdown 2 and 3. I'm slightly more understanding of why lockdown 1 happened when we didn't know about it. We didn't know enough about it. But 2 and 3 were an absolute abomination and should never have happened. And it should never happen again.
I'm not even sympathetic to 1 because I was on Mark Donald's radio show speaking out against lockdown. I was against it from the start. I never understood this thing people say now. I can understand the first one because we didn't know, blah, blah. But to me, lockdown shouldn't be an option. It was not it's like a prison thing. It was never part of pandemic planning. It was thought to be discredited already. So why? Just because this thing, we don't know how to deal with it. I know, let's lock down the population in their homes and destroy everything and destroy the economy.
All I would say about lockdown is that there is a big problem we have with the media controlling politics. So I think one of the reasons why lockdown even happened was nothing to do with the science, but because our politicians are on a leash to the mainstream media. And as long as the mainstream media project fear out to the country, then the polls push the politicians to go further and harder. And there's been no accountability from the mainstream media for what they did to this country. And the politicians should make a clean break and never be influenced by media stirring up fear. And yet they were. I think it really exposed how vulnerable our politicians are to fear being whipped up by our mainstream media. And there should be an investigation into it. what I'd say.
Yeah, it was a ridiculous loop. They were like, "Oh, people want the lockdown." It's like, yes, because you've scared them in the first place, and then your YouGov questionable polls are backing up your own policy that you want to do anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's founded by that Zahawi, who was, well, I mean, he moved on from it, but it was all very, he founded YouGov. I guess he wasn't part of it anymore, but it was all very questionable. Yeah, that was lockdown. I'm still annoyed about all that. And what about your own personal views outside of the Reform Party? So stuff like, you mentioned to me that you sort of become a sort of unlikely feminist. Not unlikely in a sense, because I suppose why not, but because it's kind of more seen as part of the left, I suppose. But you've sort of become one of the TERFs.
I am, well, I'm definitely a TERF, because if you believe, girls should have single-sex changing rooms and naked spaces, then you are automatically trans exclusionary. I've never considered myself a feminist, just because women have equal rights in law. That's what I believe feminism was all about. And it was very important when we didn't have equal rights in law, but now we do. I don't feel like I need to bang the drum. But what I would say is that in this current climate, there is a very, very damaging gender transzealotry, which completely erases women as an entire sex group, which means that, our daughters, our sisters, our mothers no longer have the protections that we worked really hard for over a century. I mean, it took about 50 years just to get the first women-only public loo, in this country. And in the space of about 5 years, it's all up for question now. So many schools don't even have girls' loos and changing rooms anymore. And it does have a direct impact on how girls and women, feel they can participate in public life. And what for? Who are we doing this for? Men don't want it. Men don't want their daughters exposed to this, or their mums in mixed sex hospital wards. So who is doing it? A tiny minority have a huge amount of power. And I'm just saying, not on my watch. I won't have lies, and it's an absolute lie saying you can change sex. And I'm so disappointed in our politicians who eggshell around the subjects. They're so terrified of trans activists' rage that they will throw women and girls under the bus. And be assured, men and boys will be next. They'll go through us all. And what's very sad is it's happening in schools, and children are being brought up to believe they're born in the wrong body. If you're a tomboy, or if you're a boy that likes to have long hair. It's crazy, it's dangerous, it's harmful, it leads to puberty blockers and irreversible sex hormones, and it's really damaging our children. And it's a hill I'm prepared to die on, Nick. But I was a member of the feminist committee actually in the EU, but I was rather a black sheep, because I would make comments such as, surely if you're a feminist, we should address how women prevent other women from progressing in the workplace, and how women could possibly back other women and girls more, because often we're our own worst enemy. And how demonizing men on every level all the time is so harmful to relationships and wrong. All this mansplaining, man-spreading, man-interrupting, all these arrows that feminists throw at men. It's not for me at all. And I don't want my daughters taught that. I have a great respect for masculinity. I say the more masculinity, the better, because it's traits that the world needs and women need. We get on with each other, and essentially women and men are great partners together in life. And it's a shame for the sexes to be put at each other's throats so much with very sort of, I'd say, liberal feminism. It's also very conditional, Nick, because this kind of liberal feminism wasn't there for the grooming gang victims. Didn't say a peep about those girls. They pick and choose which women and girls that they want to protect and defend, and that's just not for me.
Sorry to interrupt the podcast, but we have a new sponsor who is highly relevant to this episode, because we've been talking about conservatism and education, and this is the King Alfred School, the UK's first classical Christian primary school. They're a grassroots movement which exists to make classical education available to as many people as possible. And they say, do you want the next generation of English men and women to be able to think like Plato, argue like St. Paul, create like Michelangelo, command like Queen Elizabeth I, and write like Milton? Then consider supporting us at the King Alfred School in Dudley. We stand for truth, not indoctrination, goodness, not activism, and beauty, not mediocrity. We hold fast to the principles of classical education and are renewing this highly successful British method of schooling for the generations to come. Support us as we strive to bring up free thinkers who know and love their Western cultural heritage. That's their message, and you can find out more at their website, www.thekingalfredschool.co.uk, or make a donation via their GoFundMe page. Just go to gofundme.com and search Classical British Education. So it's www.thekingalfredschool.co.uk, and please support them because it's a great cause. And now back to the show. Yes. Well, I haven't man-interrupted you once. I didn't know that was even one of them. I knew there was mansplaining and manspreading, but I didn't know there was man-interrupting. But yeah, I mean, I've become a radical feminist just by being exactly the same and thinking, yeah, women should have their own changing rooms, obviously. Women should have their own sports, obviously. And you shouldn't assault someone who goes on a protest in New Zealand, I mean, and throw tomato soup on them. I mean, like, is that feminism now? It's absolutely mad. I'm an unlikely candidate, being pro-life and being kind of concerned about men's, issues in divorce laws and custody laws, and concerned about boys in schools and so on. I get branded a misogynist, but now suddenly I'm a feminist because I'm just not completely mental and don't want children to be mutilated and think women should have their own spaces. If you don't think that as a man, there is something wrong with you. If you don't have a natural protective urge for women, as you say, your daughters and mothers and things like that, there's just something completely wrong with you. So we'll agree on that. The only thing I might question is, when you said it'll be men and boys next, to me, it already has been. So there's a constant attack on masculinity. Yes. And what to me is disturbing is that they've come to women now where everyone must realise that's horrible. Like, not only half the population, but there's something disgusting about it. So here's my theory, and you can see if you disagree with me. This gets called misogyny a lot, the trans movement, and people, people like Kelly J. Keane, who I love, but they constantly talk about misogyny from the trans people. I don't think it actually is misogyny. I think it's kind of leftism or wokeism or something. But if it was misogyny, it just doesn't make sense to me. I think it's just that the elites are just getting away with this radical woke ideology that serves their interests so they can seem like they're doing something while actually not giving up any of their wealth. And that there's no group they won't throw under the bus. They've thrown men under the bus. They've thrown boys under the bus. They've thrown white people under the bus. They've thrown many different groups. And now it's just women next. So what was chilling to me about the New Zealand episode was how mainstream politicians in Australia and New Zealand were prepared to say disgusting things about women in Parliament and essentially kind of winkingly green light violence against them, I felt. But is it really misogyny or is it something else?
That's a really good point, because I don't use the term misogyny lightly. I'm fully against it becoming some kind of hate crime or that illegal, because it's a vague term. All these terms are so expanded now. They include wolf whistling, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard being made a crime, and I'm completely against that. But I do think there is an element of a disdain or huge dislike for women and girls if you want them risk to be increased to them to help a man feel included. I think you have to see women as some kind of like lower nothing that you can dispose of to campaign for men to access their changing rooms and their sports and to destroy women's sports. I don't think you can respect women and believe that there should be no women's sports and no safe places for women at the same time. You know what? I think that the trans activists and the politicians that have backed them and championed them, I think they'll be making big apologies in a few years. I think that the clock is ticking on this whole gender bomb. We've seen Nicola Sturgeon lose her crown. The Finnish PM has just been ousted. And she introduced self-ID just in February, and she's lost her crown. And I think it is imploding. And when it does, there will be a lot of people coming out that should apologise for throwing women and girls under the bus. And as you say, men and boys have been thrown under the bus constantly, especially if you're white, straight and male. It's almost like you don't deserve a platform or an opinion on the same level as anyone else, which I think is abhorrent. And worried that that's being taught in schools with critical race theory as well, and bringing up, white boys to feel like they're to blame for all the world's ills and all the world's woes. What a horrible thing to burden children with. And they give grievances to other children that they've never even experienced, because you are black, you are oppressed, and there's your oppressor over there at the other side of the classroom. This doesn't help with the mental health of young people, especially boys, either.
Yeah, and then they're surprised that they like Andrew Tate. I know, after being told that they're evil, and the first person that isn't telling them they're inherently evil comes along. Yeah, you're right about the trans issue. There's also the World Athletics trans ban on biological males competing in sports that just happened. As you say, the Sturgeon collapse because of the Isla Bryson case where this man wanted to claim to be a woman who was a rapist and get into a woman's prison. There was the assault on Kelly J. Keane in New Zealand and the disgusting rhetoric around it. There was the trans shooter in Nashville and the disgusting response to that from the left in America. Trans Day of Visibility. The White House press secretary saying trans people are under attack 3 days after a trans person murdered 6 people, Christians, including 3 children. Absolutely deranged. So their attempt to defend that has been so bizarre and insane that I think it is falling apart very quickly for them. And maybe I think I sometimes say like the outcome is misogynist. If you're assaulting a woman or you're trying to ruin their sports, that is a sort of misogynist outcome. But I just think the motivation comes from wokeness, where it goes through each oppression group and it just gets onto the next one, and now it's gay people, then it's women, and so then it's trans people, whatever it is, that oppression hierarchy they have, and they've arrived at women now.
Yeah, who's next, do you think, Nick?
Well, it's a good question. I think gay men, have they already been done? I mean, you kind of like people like Douglas Murray and Andrew Doyle lose their gay card if they have the wrong view. So maybe they've already come to gay men, or it could be them next. I suppose lesbians have been erased by the trans thing. Yeah. But you wonder, after trans people, who is there left? Is it going to be like the non-binaries and now the trans people are just old hat? I mean, where can you go from there?
I know. Well,
I do wonder what's next.
Well, I believe that I call it woke cannibalism, where actually if you are woke, you're just going to end up destroying everyone who's not the most extreme version of ideology that you hold, which is quite fun to watch them all disintegrate around each other. But I do think we are coming to an end. I do think, thank goodness to Nicola Sturgeon, the nation is waking up and saying we don't want this. The majority of people don't believe in this fantasy ideology, and it's harmful, and too much time is being spent on discussing something that's completely nuts. And all we needed was a politician to stand up and say, if you have gender dysphoria diagnosed, you deserve sympathy, compassion, therapy. Everyone else, I'm sorry. You are not a woman. You need to crack on with your own sex category. You just needed a politician to stand up. Then we wouldn't even be discussing this. But they're so terrified of the rage of the woke elitists, the woke Stasi, I call them. And the woke Stasi are actually only a tiny minority of people. I don't know where they get all their power.
I know, it's mad, isn't it? And obviously not popular with the people at all. I think I was talking to Toby Young about it. He was saying, well, it's to do with it's much harder to actually deal with the problem of the 1%, and it's much easier for the 1% of wealthy people to just sort of throw a few bones to the public and with this wokeness rather than actual radical change. And it came about from their fear of protests post 2008 crash, and I think there's something in that. But yeah, maybe transracialism is the next big thing. I mean, a few people have dabbled with it. Gary Lineker was black, and and now he's not. It's a little bit complicated, but maybe that'll be the next thing. I can't really see where else you can go, and it'll be and that'll be the new one. Because you've mentioned it a couple of times, just on that, you've already said a bit about it, but because you're a mother, right? This stuff in schools, a couple of things, critical race theory, which you've mentioned, and then this sex education stuff, it's gone so mad. We've covered it on GB several times, national news stories about this, where the kids are being taught things about rough sex at like age 12, or they're age 9 and they're being taught about gender allyship or something. And you look at kind of the materials, or there was one that asked the question, is attraction to children a sexuality? And it was kind of trying to sort of normalize attraction to children. You just think, this is incredibly sick. And the TES, formerly Times Educational Supplement, had, I believe, 900,000 resources as part of it. So it was all kind of evil garbage getting in there, and I couldn't understand why they had so many, and they obviously haven't been vetoing them properly. How has this happened, and what is the solution? Do you just have to homeschool?
Well, I do think childhood is under attack from progressive liberalism. I think they want to blur the lines between adulthood and childhood in so many different ways, and one of the ways is all of this gender stuff, the porn elements that are now coming into schools. It is often by third parties. So what happens is a third party, a charity, an organisation will come into school. The teachers won't know what they're really going to say, and the parents will have no idea, and they'll start talking about extreme porn, choking, things that children should never have to even worry about or learn about, and certainly shouldn't be normalised in a classroom, and parents never get to hear about it. And at the moment, under a Conservative government, these third parties have free rein to come into schools and teach really inappropriate, damaging stuff, whether it's on gender ideology, race, or on porn, and the parents won't know unless maybe they get an email afterwards or their child tells them. So what needs to happen, certainly what I'd like to do with Reform UK, is make sure any of these third-party charities or organisations that come into schools are registered, because at the moment they're not, and their public are completely aware of their ethos. The parents are told about them. Parents have to have some say in what their children are exposed to if they're adult themes. Also, school is not the place for this. What happened to schools being like just a safe place for learning subjects? Why on earth is it any stranger's responsibility to talk to your child about pornography? I find it grotesque. I find it grooming. And there is a kind of grooming of our children going on by strangers that's been sanitized and sanctioned under the umbrella of charity. You know, it's got charitable status. You know, we've got charities, you've got Stonewall and Mermaids, you've got charities like Arise, you've got things that organisations coming into schools. You know, in some schools now, they have separate classes after school and at weekends only for black children. They're re-racialising schools into sort of segregation with a critical race theory as well. These ideologies that are just theories and concepts, they're not facts, should never be anywhere near a primary school anyway, and should only be taught in secondary schools with the consent of parents, I think, and challenged as well. So I do think schools are no longer safe for childhood as long as this continues. And the whole purpose of a school has been completely blurred into political indoctrination, into championing ideologies uncontested. And all the Conservatives have done is sort of say, oh, well, we're concerned and we'll write a report. But there's no enforcement, there's no consequence. Ofsted should prioritise impartiality with teachers. That's another thing I would do, Nick. You know, like the Hippocratic Oath doctors have to take, you know, to take care of their patients. Teachers should take one, an oath of impartiality, and not make our classrooms like political hubbubs for the Labour Party.
To be honest, the teachers could take the same one at this point, do no harm.
Yes.
That would be good. That's the Hippocratic Oath.
Exactly.
That would be a good start.
Yeah, that's what I'd like.
Yeah. I mean, where can you go? I mean, there's some Christian schools, but they still have some woke stuff. I don't know where, if I had kids, I don't know where I'd send them. Have you, and on the porn stuff, their argument presumably would be, well, we're alerting kids to stuff they'll encounter anyway. But I don't think that argument works, because you look at the culture, it hasn't become less degenerate by talking about this stuff. It's only become far more degenerate. So I don't think any of it's worked. Like you, I say, take it out of schools. Is there anything that you'd be comfortable revealing that your kids have said? Well, have they come home and said something mad and you've gone, where's that come from? What does it not happen in your
several
school?
things. I've the amount of unravelling parents have to do at the moment when their children come home from school. So I've had the kids come home going, you old people are to blame for everything, the climate change, it's all your fault. They've come home talking about how, you know, Brexit is the worst thing that's ever happened to the country. They've learnt that in school. And also, especially on gender ideology, pamphlets were handed out to one of my daughters, and it was an all-girls school, and the pamphlets were describing what a TERF is and how if you believe in single-sex spaces, you're a bigot. So these things are getting through to children by teachers who are political activists. It's not all teachers, and actually a lot of teachers hate this, but they don't feel they're in a safe space to complain about it, because, you know, there is this kind of climate of fear now. If you reject any of the ideologies that are, you know, being imposed on our children, you're suddenly a Nazi or a bigot. So it's hard for teachers to come out too. But there are reports about many secondary schools overstepping the mark and becoming sort of politicised hubbubs that are teaching ideologies the parents don't consent to. And I've seen it with my children. Critical race theory was taught to my daughter, and I had to email the school saying my daughter's phoned up crying, saying that she's been taught white people are born racist because of the colour of their skin. They can't help but be racist. And she lost her black friends, who no longer come round and hang out because they don't like her now because she's white. This all came from a class at school. That's no good for the future of cohesion and national solidarity in this country.
Disgusting. It's a weird thing when the syllabus is encouraging bullying, and it's all this attempt to break the people from their families and turn them against their parents, and the state wants to take over your children. It makes me so mad. I don't even have kids, and I'm furious. I'm furious for my nephews and niece. I'm worried about them, but there's nothing I can do, and it makes me mad. But because you've got to go, just very quickly, I often ask this question: how do we win this culture war thing?
So I do think it will have to come from the bottom up. I think the top up have lost it. They have, as like they had Brexit derangement syndrome, they have woke derangement syndrome, and it's almost like we've lost them. We do have some really good outspoken MPs. Lee Anderson in the Conservative Party is always really outspoken on the culture wars. We need more of that, but essentially I think it has to come, parents unfortunately have to do the heavy lifting here and unravel the damage that's been done in schools to their children on these woke issues, and depoliticize the public sector, which is what I want to do, as a member of Reform UK. Make sure the public sector goes back to just service and being paid for a service, not lectures, not dividing people up, and not double standards depending on what race or sex you are. We need to depoliticize the public sector, and maybe the Tories will do it. I doubt it. They haven't done it yet. They've overseen it increase. But I hope with Reform UK that will be a home for people who want to depoliticise all the public sector and safeguard childhood as well.
All right, well, great. Well, that was really good. And I like your optimism. Good to have a bit of optimism on this podcast. And where can people find you, Belinda?
I'm on Twitter, Belinda DeLucy, and Instagram, Belinda DeLucy. There we go.
Okay, done. All right, thanks for doing the show.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's been a real pleasure. And thanks, everyone, for listening.
All right, that was Belinda. Great episode, I thought. And she's so nice, isn't she? Sometimes I think people on our side of politics, the normal people's side, they can be kind of questionable, some of their behaviours and actions. And I go, it's not really helping us. But how can anyone not like Belinda? A bit like me, really. I'm so sweet. How can you not like me? So if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. We've done up the YouTube as well. We've got new thumbnail pics. We've hired a designer. We're making a big effort, guys. If you haven't found the YouTube yet, type in Nick Dixon, current thing or whatever. You'll find it. It's there. If you're on the audio, please leave a 5-star review. Takes a few seconds. Or write a review if you're so inclined. And subscribe to the podcast. And tell a friend, because we're trying to build this thing together. Okay, see you next week.